Buddy, be seated, please. May I proceed, Mr. DeCoste?
Thank you. The less you know, the better. That's what Sigfredo Garcia said to Captain Magbanua in 2016 over the wiretaps. It's also what this government wants from you. Because the more that you know about this case, the more facts, the more you realize that the pieces don't fit and that she is innocent. During voir dire, we talked about Prince Charles, and we talked about perception versus reality. Everyone here remembers the photo that we presented of Prince Charles, and it gave a very limited view. That's what the government has done here. They've given you bits and pieces. They've tried to give you a perception of Captain Magbanua's involvement. Because, again, the more evidence, the less it fits. The defense, and you remember this from voir dire, we've given you the full picture. Not them. Ms. Kappelman can get up here and say, we gave you the information, we didn't do this bits and pieces thing. They did. We had to, on cross-examination, over and over again, bring to you evidence that put their evidence in the proper light. Let me give you a roadmap of what I'm going to talk about. Okay. The first thing, roadmap. The first thing I'm going to talk about is how the investigation into Catherine Magbanua was not objective. The second thing, the dismissal by the government, the outright dismissal of the problems and the conflicts with Luis Rivera's testimony. The third thing, how the government is ignoring evidence of Catherine Magbanua's innocence. Now, before we get deeper into it, the government, and they talked about their burden, they have to prove two things: that a crime was committed, and that the person or persons they've charged were involved in it. A majority of the evidence in this case, a vast majority of it, proves that a crime was committed. It's all over there on that table. We don't disagree with any of that evidence. We absolutely agree. Look, I've spent years looking at this case, and if I've learned anything, Professor Dan Markel was a brilliant scholar, a devoted father, an amazing for his family. No parent should ever have to bury a child, let alone sit in a courtroom and watch the first-degree murder trial, the gruesome first-degree murder trial for their son. For the people of Tallahassee, and Ms. Kappelman said it best, suffered a blow. Crimes impact everyone, especially this case. Those who are responsible, and again, they spent hours, days talking about the Adelsons. Those responsible must be brought to justice. The Adelsons. Now, given all of this emotion, it's resulted in desperation for the government. You heard it for them. It took them a while to figure out a theory to move forward on the case. But that's what happened. They came to a determination on their theory. We get bored up here. They came to a determination on their theory. Then they started to look at Catherine Magbanua. But when they looked at her, they didn't look at her to objectively investigate her. Instead, they tried to build a case around her, to force her to cooperate, so that they could get what they've been going after for years now, the Adelson family. Someday, there will likely be a jury in this courthouse determining the fate of one or all the Adelsons. But you're not that jury. You're here, and again, these are separate cases. It's State of Florida v. Sigfredo Garcia, State of Florida v. Catherine Magbanua. We talked about it in jury selection. These are not together. It's not a package deal. You're here to determine the guilt individually of Catherine Magbanua. And again, she's innocent. You know, if the government wants to charge the Adelsons, charge them. It appears that they have more evidence against them than the defendants in this courtroom. You know, years ago, many, many years ago in our civilization, in times of strife, drought, famine, we'd be willing to sacrifice the innocent for the betterment of all. But we all know we've advanced as a society. What happened to Dan Markel was tragic, but convicting an innocent woman doesn't fix that. Nor does it in any way honor the memory of Professor Dan Markel. Now, two things the government has to do. Prove that a crime was committed. There was a crime. He was murdered. We absolutely do not disagree with that. But with respect to Miss Magbanua, they have to prove that she was involved. All of that has to do with the crime. This staff right here, which includes financials, which includes CDs, wiretaps. This is the case against her. This right here, this is the evidence against her. Our first topic. How the investigation into Catherine Magbanua was not objective. Instead, it was to build a case because of what their target is. Let me give you some examples, and we saw it in this trial from some of the witnesses. And we saw the early stages of objectivity, the middle stages, in the testimony. Investigator Jason Newland took the stand. He talked about how he got information about a gun, and he went out and found that gun, but how that gun didn't match up with the case. But he didn't just leave it there. He didn't just dismiss it. No. He took photographs of it. He brought out 2 other personnel from the prosecutor's office. They cataloged it. They turned it in. They checked it back out. They brought it to FDLE, and you heard from the FDLE analyst, Danabeth Ritchie, how she went through a very extensive process of evaluating that gun. All the paperwork that she put together. All the reviews she did. That it wasn't a quick process. Now, that was very early in the trial. And it may not have made sense at that time, but it was for this explanation now. That's what objectively reviewing a piece of evidence looks like. Jason Newland didn't just say, well, it doesn't apply, I'm not going to look at it. No, he still went through the proper steps. Because if there isn't objectivity in this process, it leads to wrongful convictions. It leads to misunderstood evidence. Next, we saw it from Sean Yao. He was the one that talked about the height of the shooter. Now, he had a bunch of variables, sort of like the government has their pieces of evidence. He knew the positioning of the seat, the height of Professor Markel, the point of entry in the window. And he was able to come to, not a certainty, but it's consistent with a taller shooter. But when I asked him, I go, you can't say that it could have been something else. There could have been a variable off. The seat could have moved. He could have been in a different position. He goes, look, I can't do that. That's looking at the evidence objectively. I can't tell you beyond a reasonable doubt that the height of the shooter was this, but it's consistent with it. Translation, it fits, but it's not enough. Last, we saw it from Sergeant Chris Corbett, talked about the cell phone stuff, took the stand every other day in this trial. he was asked questions about the cell phone stuff. Some of my questions, that it wasn't accurate what he was saying. Now, when I say not accurate, I'm not saying what he was saying was inaccurate, but that this whole thing with cell phone technology, when they show a map and there's a dot, doesn't mean that they can prove that the person was there. We heard it from Mr. Garcia's expert. You can be miles and miles and miles away. And I asked Sergeant Corbett the question. Basically, you can say that these people were all in the general vicinity of Miami on a given time. He gave those answers. That's being objective. He didn't try to stick to his guns and go, no, no, and fight it. Gave the good with the bad. These are examples. We have both the investigation stage and the testimony stage. That's what objectivity looks like and should look like in this courtroom and during the investigation. But again, the investigation of Catherine Magbanua was not objective. You know, when I was a kid, my father, he traveled a lot for business. And he told me a story once, how he was out in the Midwest, and he's driving along a road. There's a bunch of farms, and he sees, and it's pretty close to the roadway, he sees a side of a barn. There's a young kid out there. And on the side of the barn, there's a few bullseyes, and there's an arrow right in the bullseye. He had to find out, how is it that this kid is so good, little kid, how is he so good at hitting the bullseye? My father drove over, he asked him, and the kid said, "I'm going to show you." Kid fired a shot into the side of the barn, wildly missing all of the targets. But he hit the side of the barn. Then took a pail of paint, walked up, painted the target around the arrow. That's what the government is trying to do here to Catherine Magbanua. And we'll get into all the things they didn't do. They had leads. They didn't run it down. She worked at those nightclubs. They didn't go there. The idea was to paint the target around her, to force her to cooperate. Again, the government came up with their theory that it was the Adelsons. They identified Catherine, built the case around her. Now, in part, I don't fault the government for being personally motivated, interested. But you got to make sure that you don't turn a blind eye to other things. Let's go to the call activity. The government has made a big issue that Charles Adelson was communicating with Catherine Magbanua and that Catherine Magbanua was communicating with Sigfredo Garcia. Now, if there were no connections in between these people whatsoever, maybe some evidence. But there were. Catherine's dating Charles Adelson. It's only natural that she's going to call him. She has 2 children with Sigfredo Garcia. It's only natural that they're going to communicate. I don't doubt that most of the people in this courtroom, when they left for lunch, called the important people in their lives. That's normal. That happens. But the government, they gave you that very limited perception. They showed you certain days and go, they're talking. They even removed out other communications that Catherine and others were having with other people to make it look like the calls were going Sigfredo to Catherine, Catherine to Charles. You have it in evidence, in our evidence, not what they've submitted, in our evidence showing there's more calls that are in there. But it was important to pull a random day. And during trial, we pulled May 1st, not an important day in the case, to show that this was normal levels of communication for Catherine, again, for the guy she was dating, and the father of her children. Next, and we're talking about the investigation into circumstantial evidence. Cash deposits. They saw cash in her account, and they presented it to you as unexplained cash. Trying to paint those circles around the arrow brighter and brighter, thicker and thicker. Investigator Isom took the stand. He knew she was working at nightclubs. Quote, knew. Zero investigation was done. There was no reason. And his answer was, it was an oversight. Agent Sanford, his was, there was no doubt, quote, no doubt, she was making cash tips, which would explain this money coming into her account. But zero investigation was done. No subpoenas sent out. No interviews. The government had the audacity, despite the fact that it is their burden to say in their closing argument, where are the witnesses? Where are the witnesses? As if we have a responsibility. Had the FBI walked into those nightclubs, I have no doubt they would have given answers. But again, they never did it. But why? Why would they not do this? The reason is you go in there and you find out an explanation for that cash, those circles around that arrow start to evaporate a little bit. You lose a piece of evidence. Now, you may be thinking, well, if they were just trying to frame somebody, why would they create evidence? Well, there's a problem with that. It's easier to just suppress it, to make it seem like you never knew about it, because you create something, you got a problem. Because there may be something out there later on that will contradict it. We'll see that when we talk about Luis Rivera. It's better to just turn a blind eye, like the ostrich with its head in the sand. I'm not going to look at it, I'm not going to see it. It's willful ignorance. It has no place in a murder investigation. Although we didn't have to, we presented evidence. Now, put it in context, our ability to get evidence. Catherine Magbanua has been sitting in custody, in confinement for years. She was arrested years after this happened. The ability to then find evidence and put it together is a difficult process, but thankfully, the government subpoenaed records from Facebook. We had to submit to you. They presented it that there was no evidence whatsoever of cash-paying jobs. We presented to you from 2013 that she begins working promotions. Following later, and continuing until 2015, working at a larger nightclub. Now, there's one thing that the government didn't address, and I'm going to come back to the nightclubs. The fact that Sigfredo Garcia, during that time, the father of her 2 children, was not working the steady employment he was working later on. And that cash, similar to the $5,000 that was found inside of his car when he was arrested, would have been going to Miss Magbanua for the betterment of her children. Now, the government brought up Yindra Velasquez, but you got to remember what she said. The government has tried to downplay the nightclub by saying bar. How much somebody would make, a couple $100. We're talking about a nightclub in Miami, not a bar, a nightclub in Miami, having special events for celebrities, having big nights. She worked with Yindra Velasquez at a different location at a different time. In the middle of 2014, Yindra Velasquez said, I didn't know she was working there. Well, you got to remember, during that time, Yindra Velasquez was pregnant with a child. Catherine, her children, were born, several years old. They're leading different lives at that time. The government presented a bar chart of deposits. They really started using this late in trial. Put a spike right there. First and foremost, if you're receiving money from a murder, who in their right mind would deposit it? Those are acts of an innocent person, not knowing where the money's coming from. You're not going to put that into a bank account. Did Sigfredo Garcia put any money into his bank account? No. Luis Rivera? No. Those are the actions of somebody who's getting their money from legitimate sources. So, again, the government has put this chart together. They didn't exactly give their specialist, Mary Hull, all the information, though. Despite having from Facebook and knowing from investigator Isom and Patrick Sanford, Agent Sanford, that she was working at nightclubs, they just presented it to her and go, these are where she worked, no mention of cash. This is what this graph should look like. And these dates are based on the evidence that we have from their evidence and from the testimony of Ms. Magbanua. Now, the government, in their closing argument, said, well, Ms. Magbanua was not able to answer specific names from work 6 years ago and 4 years ago. Yet at the same time, they're talking out of the other side of their mouth in voir dire saying, well, you know, it's natural. People are going to forget some of the facts. It's okay for Rivera, not okay for Catherine Magbanua. I don't think I need to get in. We know that Luis Rivera has not been in solitary confinement, that he's been in general population. I don't need to get into what it can do to the mind of a person spending 3 years in solitary confinement. Not knowing what day it is, what year it is. Despite this, the government has done a majority of the defensive work in this courtroom by fighting against even the thought that she was working a cash job. Their energy should have been spent investigating it. They also brought in Mary Hull for another thing. Now, Mary Hull was brought in. She was given limited information for her expert opinion. She got up on the stand and she talked about the yearly totals. Now, the whole point of this, and it's obvious to all of us, was to say, look at 2013 and then look at 2014. She didn't explain what those dashes are. It was just presented to you. Look at the spike. Painting those circles, bolder and bolder. It wasn't until she was on cross-examination with me that I brought out what I already knew. You don't have records, although you could have gotten them. You don't have records for half of the beginning of the year. Nor do you have it in 2016 for the remaining half. Her response was, well, that's why I put the dashes there. How are we supposed to know what that means? She's the expert. She should have explained to you. You can't compare 2013 to 2014 because you want to know what? We only have half the year. But remember, late 2013 is when Catherine starts working, doing brand promotion. This government wants to fault a young mother for working multiple jobs, trying to do anything she can, even if it means taking money from Mr. Garcia that may not be from honest places, but not knowing where it's coming from for the support of her children. Go next to Ms. Magbanua's breast surgery. There is zero evidence, zero, that it was paid for from the proceeds of a homicide. Ms. Magbanua explained to you she's wanted to have it for a very long time. She's given birth to 2 children. It's something that she's wanted to do. And the government gets up here and almost makes a mockery of it, trying to play on words in between tips and her surgery. It's inappropriate in a first-degree murder trial. Going back to Investigator Yao, Sergeant Corbett, Jason Newland, and talking about how you objectively view something. You see those medical records, okay, it's a cash payment, there's debit card payments. What and Sean Yassay say, it fits that, it fits that. Sergeant Corbett, same thing. But they didn't. They came in here and said, this is evidence that she was involved. Mind you, the whole time knowing that she's working a cash job and just completely disregarding that. Next. The car. You know, it's interesting, they brought out how Miss Magbanua was arrested in that vehicle. Meaning they had the opportunity to take photos of it. They had the opportunity to get the mileage, the condition, all of that. But no, they wanted to present before a jury, she's driving around in the Adelson's car. Because it makes that target so much more bold, so much more bright. They didn't investigate further into it, nor did they ever look at it objectively, because if you look at it objectively, you have a title for a purchase of a vehicle. Objectively viewed, that's somebody who has purchased a vehicle. At the end, all you can take from that is that she bought a old, I'm not saying it's not a nice car. Many of us would love to have that. But in comparison to the wealth of the Adelsons, who they've said are these multi-millionaires, a 14-year-old Lexus with 160,000 miles is barely payment for helping commit a murder. What it is, it's a friend, an ex-girlfriend, buying an old used car from an ex-boyfriend. But they've submitted to you as proof. That's not objective. As proof of guilt. Let's common sense look at this right now. All right? Catherine's innocent, but let's imagine for a second that they have this agreement. How foolish is it to then create this legal paper trail to this person? That's not how that works. That's not how somebody, if you're committing a crime of that magnitude, you do not want to have any connections. Let's go to the paychecks now. The Adelson Institute. Submitted to you money from the Adelsons, and she didn't work there. Again, painting that target. Along the same lines of common sense and how it'd be foolish, again, you're creating a paper trail, employment records, tax documents. That would be a crazy thing to do if you want to distance yourself from somebody, should anybody ever get investigated or arrested in the future. Now, it was presented over to Mary Hull. She came back and she did this diagram of paychecks. And almost like reading tea leaves, the government is trying to say, this is evidence of guilt. And Mary Hull got up there and goes, well, these checks are written before the date of work. Nonsense. Absolute nonsense. Every single one of these checks, but for one or two that was cashed a few days early, were deposited by Miss Magbanua after the dates of work. They didn't do anything to establish Don Adelson's check writing practices. They had Erica Johnson and Clariza Labredo on the stand and didn't get into that topic. They didn't have Mary Hull evaluate the check writing practices for the other employees, but instead, they want to read the tea leaves and say, it's evidence of a murder. It went further, though. You would think, and we're still on the topic of the Adelson Institute, you would think, you help a family commit this murder that they've wanted so bad, you're going to get some dental work on the house. They brought in text messages. We're in a first-degree murder trial trying to interpret text messages for guilt. They submitted to you one where she got whitening gel from Charles Adelson. But they didn't give you, again, we had to bring it in and show it to you. How? Months after the murder, she's paying the Adelson Institute $206.50 And we know from the text messages around that same time that it was because Catherine Magbanua went there for work. Now the government tried to differentiate and go, well, wait a second. It's clear she saw Harvey Adelson. Yeah, his son, I'm pretty sure, could get a discount from Dad for the person that helped commit a murder, if any of that were true. But the text messages went even further. These checks, and we know it from the government's exhibit, these checks began September 15th. Text messages between Catherine Magbanua and Charles Adelson at the day before. I'll let you know on my availability so you can know more or less how many hours I can dedicate. Thank you again. They tried to introduce text messages, say, well, that's about wisdom teeth. I had my wisdom teeth taken out. I don't ever remember communicating with my dentist saying, I'll let you know how many hours I can dedicate my availability. That's a text message about work. But they are so blind to this that they won't accept it. Because in their mind, from the very beginning, Catherine is guilty, and they will only ever look at her through dirty windows. The government argued that, well, there was no evidence. They've said that a lot. Well, there's no evidence of it, so it must not be true. During and I almost called it an investigation, but it wasn't, because no investigative work was done. Investigator Isom knew that her job was to communicate with patients, came out on the stand. Nothing was done. On the wiretaps, on call RR and E, these are two calls from the wiretaps in 2016, they're talking about her calling patients. But again, the government is still trying to defend against it and say, whoa, 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 she was never at the location. And why would the Adelson Institute be paying for Charles Adelson? They're trying to split hairs. They're trying to divert the attention away from the fact she was working for him. That was earned money. Call E talks about work as well, too. Back on the call activity, the government brought up the fact that there was a phone call to one of Luis Rivera's old phone numbers, but that's not what the evidence showed. Rivera was on the stand and he said his number was 934-6615. Agent Sanford was put on the stand by the government, and on cross, not on direct, on cross-examination, it was brought out that the phone number that he got in review and the phone number that he had in his report, again, this is the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I don't think that they're used to hearing no when they want things. That they have the number of 935-6615. The government still wants to be able to argue and say, well, you know, it's close, it's evidence. No subpoena was ever sent to find out who either of those phone numbers belonged to. It'd be very easy for Luis Rivera, looking at the call records, which he would have in discovery, and just making things up. But we'll get into that a little bit more later. The car rental in June. Now, we talked a little bit about cell phone activity. Now, they put a map up there, and they've got a dot right near the car rental place. But what they're not showing you, is all the other businesses. All those little squares that are in there, those are city blocks. This is miles and miles and miles of territory. There are major highways in there. There's an airport, Miami International Airport, a massive airport right there. They never showed you any other days. June 3rd, June 9th. Now, that's their expert. He does plotting for that. It was easy for me to go in and look at the call records and say, look, you know, on this random day of May, it's the same activity. They're picking bits and pieces to put together this tapestry of the guilt. What they're not doing is looking at any of it objectively. Now, this wasn't enough evidence for them. Admittedly, They didn't have enough. But they were still desperate. They still needed to move forward on the case. So in 2016, they tried to create some more to get bolder circles. They did the wiretaps. They did the bump, and they also had the wiretaps. Now, these wiretaps, and it's part of this stack here. Again, this is everything. And we've already gone through most of this stuff. For months, they listened to her phone calls. Secretly listening to her phone calls, talking to people that they believe she was involved in this conspiracy with. Hundreds of calls, hundreds of texts. Not one thing, not one thing of her being involved in this murder. Only her needing to know less. Now, the fact that Charles Adelson and Catherine Magbanua were communicating, it wasn't irregular. We brought that out on the stand, that before the bump, before anybody may think, hey, we might be getting listened to, that Charles Adelson and Catherine Magbanua were still communicating. So it wasn't just out of the blue, this bump happens, and all of a sudden there's phone calls. Now, the way the bump was done dictated the actions that then followed. It was controlled. The undercover, and you'll be able to watch it again if you need to, reference son, reference Catherine twice, and reference Tuto. Now, the letter that was handed, we have to take the FBI's word for what was actually written on there, and whether there were not other instructions. How is it that the Federal Bureau of Investigation, with all of their resources, infinite, doesn't have a copy of the letter that was handed for this huge operation? Now, this goes back to what I was saying before. It's easier to hide things than it is to create them. Meaning that if it's just, hey, we don't have a photo of it, if it surfaces years later, to be like, oh yeah, that's what was in there. We have no idea of knowing what was written on there and how that then dictated the actions that then followed. But the government wants you to take it as evidence of guilt. Now again, there's nothing in there talking about Catherine being involved in any of this, but they want to interpret action and inaction, what somebody would do, as if there's standard protocol for such a situation. The response from Agent Sanford as to why there was not a copy of it, it slipped their minds. Now, had the bump been uncontrolled, had it been that they just handed the piece of paper, $5,000, and then you had that communication, that would be evidence of something. But they didn't do that. Now ask yourself why they didn't do that. They didn't do it because the hope was to create communication to paint those targets more. The proper thing to do, the objective thing to do, hand that flyer and see what happens. Plant that seed and see what happens. Whatever they say, tickle the wire and see what happens. Not give instructions on what to do. I submit to you that Catherine was being used in those communications by Charles Adelson, who, as Catherine said, definitely involved. Now, she's saying that not because she has information about it, but she's seen what all of you have seen during this trial. Again, you want to charge him, charge him. In the first 3 phone calls, and we know this from Agent Sanford, that Charles Adelson says to Donna Adelson, don't talk in the apartment. Now, it's easy to understand what that meant. Don't say anything that's going to get us in trouble. Now, the government talks about WhatsApp and how people can be communicating from WhatsApp when it helps their theory, but when it doesn't and it explains things, disregard them. Donna Adelson assumed that the ex-girlfriend was the most recent ex-girlfriend. Look, if I say to my mother, my ex-girlfriend, she's not going to think, well, is it one from, high school, or is it the last one? It's natural. That's a natural thing that a mother would do. But there's additional communications, there's additional meetings. Charles is not sure, eventually learns that Catherine's name was mentioned. But in that first phone call with Catherine, if they are involved in this conspiracy to commit murder, to be like, look, somebody came up, there would be talk about it, but there would also be, don't say anything. Nowhere in any of those wiretaps do you ever hear, don't talk in the apartment, don't do anything that's going to get me in trouble. It's actually the opposite of that, and we'll get into that in a minute. Now, let's get a little bit more into the action. I can't say why Charles Adelson did what he did, but certain things make sense. Our theory is that him and Sigfredo Garcia had an agreement. Now, the government wants to say that it was through Catherine Magbanua. Our position is it was about Catherine Magbanua. Now, when that happens, the bump happens, Charles Adelson can't call over to Sigfredo Garcia. You don't know. Is he already working with the police? If I contact him, I'm going to get in trouble. I've got to distance it. Catherine, the bump gave him the idea to use Catherine as a buffer. Find out who it is. Call that number. Think about this. He believes, or he's involved in this conspiracy with Catherine, and he's thinking, hey, it could be the FBI, it could be the cops. That he would say, hey, I want you to call that number, knowing that she could say something wrong, she could do something wrong to incriminate him. The reason why he was so confident with having her call is because he knew she didn't know anything. Now, let's talk about the flow of knowledge. Your Honor, let me know if you need to slide this back for you. Now, the bump happens with Don Adelson. Happens here. Conveys the information over to Charles Adelson. That information then goes to Catherine Magbanua, and we know that that information then goes over to Sigfredo Garcia. But when Catherine wants to know, what is this about? The answer is, the less you know, the better. There's no information flowing in between there. Now, from Agent Sanford, well, it was Investigator Dillmore talked about the fact how there was communication in between Luis Rivera and Sigfredo Garcia. Luis Rivera was in federal custody, and he was contacting a friend to send text messages to certain people. Luis Rivera identified that on the stand. Investigator Dillmore, in reviewing Sigfredo Garcia's phone, saw that there were communications with T, talking about Luis Rivera. So, the flow of information from the bump made it around the horn. One would think that if this is a conspiracy, the information is then going to flow back. But it didn't. Agent Sanford said how there was a point where Charles Adelson was sure it was the cops. And then he tells Catherine. If it were set up in the way that they think it was, that information would have flown back, and Catherine would have been the one telling him. Who told Charles Adelson? Let's turn now to Dolce Vita. Can't understand any of it, much of it. Catherine got on the stand, she could have lied. Said, well, this is what was being said, that was being said. You can't understand it. This is what was being said, that was being said. Instead, she said, look, I don't remember. To her, that wasn't a conversation about a conspiracy of the murder of his brother-in-law. It was just another day sitting down with Charles where he's talking about how his family is getting harassed and how her name had been put into it. She did tell you, I didn't discuss a murder with him. And the government showed a clip of it and tried to say, well, he had that paper. You all saw it. He had that paper, if it even was the same one, and had it in his lap. never showed it to her. The very little portions that you can make out of it, what it is Charles giving hypotheticals of what Catherine should do and say to scare off the person. And he's mostly describing himself. Be afraid of me, because I may come back, I may do something. But it was like all the other times for Charles, it was just him talking and talking and talking. Now the government brought out the fact that the cops weren't contacted. We covered this a lot on cross-examination. Catherine wasn't bumped, or harassed, or called, or texted. It wasn't her place. It wasn't her place to be calling the police because it wasn't directly against her. And we see this more in call DD. Quote, "I'm trying to get whoever is threatening your family and helping you guys out." These are not the communications somebody's going to be having if they're involved in a conspiracy to commit murder. Those aren't the communications that are going to be had. Now, they'll come back and they'll say, well, it's code, or, no, that's hogwash. These are not the communications that you're going to have. And they say, well, nobody went to the cops. It was Catherine the one. Catherine stuck in the middle. Stuck in the middle, not getting any information from Sigfredo, not getting any information, finding out things later on from Charles Adelson, who's getting frustrated. Why is my name being mentioned? And she's the one that says, I'm about to go, and she hates that she swore. And we even see it from her text messages. She won't even spell out swear words. The effing FBI. If she were involved in this conspiracy, thinking, well, it's either the Latin Kings or whoever did this, or it's the FBI. Those words, I'm about to go to the FBI, and the way that she said it, which was not I'm thinking about doing it, it's, I am about to go to them myself. Those words would have never come out of her mouth. Even at that point, it wasn't enough. It wasn't enough evidence. The only remaining piece of evidence, the only thing, which brings us to our second topic, this guy right here. Luis Rivera. Second topic, Luis Rivera, outright dismissal of the problems with his story. Not the facts, with his story. We had approximately 40 witnesses testify during this trial, maybe a little bit more, maybe a few less. He is the only one. The only one. Mary Hull is not a witness to events. Chris Corbett is not a witness to events. The only one is Luis Rivera. Now, the consensus among the Tallahassee Police Department and the FBI is that prior to Rivera, it was not enough to arrest. Now, arresting somebody is a much lower standard than trial. There's a big difference between probable cause to arrest, which you heard about during trial, and beyond and to the exclusion of every reasonable doubt. Rivera cooperated. Now, had Luis Rivera said Catherine Magbanua's name in August, when they were doing this communicating through cans and lines, where Luis Rivera's in the other room with his attorney, and his cavalman's in the other room, if he had said Catherine at that time, she would have been arrested the next day. But it wasn't until he finally realized, I've got to give him more. And we'll talk about that in a minute. I've got to give them more. Because Luis Rivera couldn't say, well, yeah, Sigfredo Garcia was involved. That wouldn't get him a deal. If he wanted a deal, he had to give them something. He cooperates. The very next day, Catherine is arrested. To convict Catherine Magbanua, Catherine is innocent. She is innocent of all three of these charges. To convict her, you have to believe Luis Rivera, a man who cannot be trusted. His testimony was a convoluted mess, full of contradictions. From that convoluted mess, you can take two things, and only two things that apply to Catherine. Again, I don't doubt that this guy was in Dan Markel's driveway, not for a second. But the information that he gives against Catherine Magbanua, it's only two things. That he heard some phone calls, and then on July 19th, Catherine paid money. Now the heard calls thing, that's an easy lie. It's an easy lie for him. He has the reports. He has the police reports. And from Agent Sanford, we know that the basics, and from Sergeant Corbett, the basics of the travel, the communication, that was in those reports. And he would have that information. Plus, he knows Sigfredo Garcia's habits of communicating with the mother of his children. Easy, but he failed. He said that on June 4th, on the trip up, that Catherine Magbanua and Sigfredo Garcia were constantly on the phone. The answer to that? To quote Chodrick Nobles, nope. Sergeant Corbett got up on the stand, and he showed you that there was a 29-second phone call. Throughout that entire time, there was a 29-second phone call. Again, this is Luis Rivera trying to give them something to get that deal. Let's go to 719. Another easy lie. He has the reports. He has the details. The general vicinity of people and places. It's easy for him to build his lies within that framework. But another fail. He said, oh, Catherine called me. Now, he knew that there was phone communication, but he didn't know the specifics. Catherine called me. Again, wrong. Sergeant Corbett got up there and he goes, no, it was Luis Rivera calling her. The government will get up here and probably say this is a minor detail. It's a huge detail because these are the pieces of evidence that Luis Rivera is giving. And Luis Rivera is the sole witness against her. He also said that he was at the barbershop, over at Ray's Barbershop on Biscayne. Wrong. He was in a different municipality. He was over in Miami Beach, and we know that from the record. So, how and why? How and why did all of this happen? The guy was looking at the death penalty. The evidence against him strong. The evidence against him strong. He's already doing 12 years. Meanwhile, the government, desperate to do something with their case, and they cut a deal. Now again, he'd get nothing for naming somebody who they already have. Sigfredo Garcia was arrested alongside with Luis Rivera. You're not going to get anything by naming the other guy that's already charged. You've got to name new people. Desperate government, desperate Luis Rivera, they come to a deal where, and Mr. Zengane got up here and said that it would be about 19 years. No, remember, with gain time, he's only going to do a percentage of that. Do 12, maybe 12 in federal custody. Then there's 7. Maybe he does another 4 or 5 years. For a guy like Luis Rivera, that's just a cost of doing business. That's a cost of being a criminal. That's expected. Now, this whole thing about threats, that, because he snitched, that he's a threat. This guy's been the boss of a gang since he was 15 years old. Different rules apply to him. Clearly they do, because he's in general population and he hasn't been touched. That's why it happened. But how did it happen? Again, I've gone over it, but it's worth going over again one time of how Luis Rivera was able to do this. He has reports that detail things, not to the level that you saw in this trial, but reports laying out the framework of things. He's also got the media. You've seen it during this trial. All over the place. And it's been all over the place. He has TV in jail. He's got friends and family outside. He knew the facts. He knew the theory. That gave him the framework. Now, I'm not trying to say that anybody spoon-fed it to him and said, you got to say this. I don't think that happened. But I think that this guy, the head of a gang at 15 years old, that's a smart guy. Be it either he figured it out himself or somebody told him. That's what he did. But he could only think one-dimensionally. He couldn't see how this would contradict other things later on because the information he had was limited. The direction of the calls, the cell site data, that was done on the stand here. He had the basics of it. But it's when you get into the details that you realize there's no way that he's correct. Now, remember, he knew the theory. They want Catherine. But Wendy Adelson was also mentioned all over the place. And he tried. He tried to give them Wendy Adelson. He knew that she was a target. He tried again and he failed. Now, he said that on July 17th, that he saw Wendy Adelson at the house and that Sigfredo Garcia said, that's the woman. But his story, and this doesn't happen with the truth, you usually get more of a story at the beginning and then your memory fades over time. But his apparently got better over time. Because his original statement was, I saw Wendy at the house. Then it was with the kids. And then most recently in 2019, it was, I saw Wendy with the kids and they walked into the house on Trescott. Now, we're going to come back to that in a second, but why would Luis Rivera be doing that? Why would his story be so motivated? He may have been on that witness stand, but in his mind, he's still at defense counsel table. Because the government still has him. It's within their power to say whether Luis Rivera has lived up to his end of the deal, whether they want to violate him or not. Now, this whole thing about the violation of probation, Luis Rivera didn't know about that until we told him. They didn't tell him, his attorneys didn't tell him, nobody told him. So there's the additional fact that he needs to make sure that he's not at odds with the state of Florida, because they can still potentially get him for 15 years. Back to July 17th. His story is now he sees the kids walking into the house. It's not possible. Doesn't matter who told him what. He's trying to give up Wendy Adelson because he knows that's going to better his deal. But it's not possible. And we know that, and this is part of the stipulation, that on Thursday, July 17, 2014, the kids were dropped off at 8:30 a.m. at Creative Preschool. What other woman with 2 children would be walking into Dan Markel's house with 2 young boys? It's clearly Luis Rivera trying to lie and give up more people, because the more people, look, this guy's ruthless. He doesn't care about sending somebody away for his own good. His life is about taking from other people. And he gets a deal by taking from her. He added more to his lie, to his story. You know, I got mad at Sigfredo. And he got on the phone with Catherine, and that happened before noon. But see, that's a problem. Every time he gets too specific, that's when he gets caught in a lie. Because Sergeant Corbett told us there is no phone call. There is no phone call from Sigfredo Garcia to Catherine Magbanua before the afternoon on that day. Now, the government, in their desperation, tried to fix this with Sergeant Corbett on redirect. And they pointed to a call much later in the afternoon to try to make it seem like, well, that's the call. But the problem was that phone call was from Catherine to Sigfredo Garcia, not the other way around. That's defensive work. Guys? There was an additional time that he tried to give up Wendy. On June 5th, he said that, and this is in one of his statements, one of the many different ones, he says that they get up there the next day, that they're following Markel, and that they are Professor Markel, and that they follow him to the Creative Preschool, but then they lose him. Well, we know from Jeffrey Lacoste that that's wrong. Because Jeffrey Lacoste had a memory of that time frame and said, Wendy had the kids. Professor Markel would not have been dropping off the kids or picking them up that day. Now, there's other minor inconsistencies. The owl. This is an easy one. You know, Luis Rivera spins a lie. He doesn't give a time frame. And he goes, oh, yeah. Then Catherine called. Again, there's normal communication between Catherine Magbanua and Sigfredo Garcia. So it's easy to say this lie. Going back to objectively investigating things, of course, the Tallahassee Police Department, the Leon County State Attorney's Office, the FBI, they sent a subpoena to either, because remember, he said two different things. It was Instagram, Facebook. Minor inconsistency. But the problem here is nobody ever subpoenaed the records from those social media outlets to find out if the guy was telling the truth. They did it for Catherine, they did it for Sigfredo to paint those circles or to try, but they don't do it for him. My belief is they didn't trust him. We dig any deeper on this, it's gonna show that he's lying. We dig any deeper on Catherine Magbanua, it's gonna show she's telling the truth. There was other inconsistencies. When he learned of it, it was either before, it was during, or after. Whether there was one guns or two guns. Whether he was the driver in the first trip, but then there was a citation. You know, his defense to all that was, well, you know, we were high and drunk. But that didn't make sense because Trooper Downing was like, you know, I don't know if he was a captain, a lieutenant, but he was high ranking. And he's like, if that were going on, if people were smoking marijuana, they were drinking inside of a car, everybody knows that smell would be in there. And an FHP trooper would have pulled them out and questioned him on that. He's doing that as a defense to getting caught in a lie. Because if he gets caught, he can go, hey, I was drunk, I was high. This is not a dumb man. And along that line, he says he can't read or write. Well, that's odd. We know he was driving because of the citation. And I'm pretty sure most of the people in this courtroom know that when you get a driver's license in the state of Florida, you got to take a monitored, written exam. That's a way to defend against the lies. Louis, we want you to look. I can't read. That guy can read. Don't be fooled. About 40 witnesses in this case. Not one. All of them combined, all of the impeachment combined for all of the other witnesses does not equal the amount of times that this guy was impeached. He's smart, but when you're making up lies, and we all know the phrase, the devil is in the details. And that's where we were able to, by digging deep into what he was saying, to realize this guy is not telling the truth. Who is he protecting? What is he protecting? Despite many, many rehearsals, many times that he gave this statement, he still couldn't keep it straight. Despite help from the government. There's no recordings of some of the meetings. No recordings. Why would that happen? That's inexcusable. The Tallahassee Police Department doesn't have a policy that you can't record. The FBI, Agent Sanford said, well, you know, it's our policy, we don't record under certain scenarios, but you always do a report. And when he was confronted with that, no, I didn't do the one person he interviewed where there's no recording and no report. The only time. They don't even trust him. They don't even trust Luis Rivera. But these prosecutors want you to trust him. This man can't be trusted. Investigator Isom, thankfully, did a report of one of those meetings. And he said how at the beginning Luis Rivera was sworn in to tell the truth and the whole truth. But he didn't say anything about a third trip. He didn't say anything about Wendy walking into the house. That came out years later. And he never said anything about King Little Anthony. Now this government, in their defensive work, has tried to say, hey, it has nothing to do with the Latin Kings. They're trying to protect their convictions. He's trying to protect his brothers. They're trying to say that there's no connection to the Latin Kings, but then Luis Rivera is saying King Little Anthony went up on a trip. Well, that's a connection. No investigation done. Nobody ever met with him. Nobody ever tried to find him. Conveniently, he's now dead. And nobody will ever know. Whether Luis Rivera was telling the truth or not about this guy, I have no idea. But all I know is that this government didn't do anything with it, and they're trying to fight against a connection when clearly their star witness is saying that there was a connection. Let's compare Luis Rivera to another witness we had in this case. We had Jeffrey Lacasse. And everybody should remember Jeffrey Lacasse. He testified early in the trial. And he was a one-time boyfriend of Wendy Adelson. Now, Jeffrey Lacasse was testifying about things many years ago. His inconsistencies were reasonable. Memories fade with time. Excuse me. At the beginning of the investigation, he was a suspect. Now, the government brought it up on close. We don't think Jeffrey Lacasse was involved, nor has any argument been made. But at the beginning, he was a suspect. And he was removed as a suspect because they objectively investigated him. He showed bank records, they got surveillance from Walmart, they spoke to him, and they cleared him. Nothing like that was done with Miss Magbanua. But they had multiple recorded interviews. They interviewed this guy who they believed was a suspect. Again, this is before they've committed to their bogus theory. Jeffrey Lacasse is a suspect. Look, he's dating Wendy Adelson. He's possibly protecting her. He leaves town right around the time that it happens. Could be something there, but they objectively investigated him. They had multiple interviews, and they were recorded. He also gave a deposition. So, like Luis Rivera, he gave multiple statements, but when he got up on the stand, he had a reasonable memory of events. He was able to remember things. In line with Miss Magbanua, I can remember some, I can't remember all of it exactly. What was the name of the restaurant you were at? That's reasonable. Somehow, Luis Rivera, his memory gets better in time with things and worse in other areas. It's because it's not based in reality. It's based on trying to weave a lie. Now, Jeffrey Lacasse was up there. He was not evasive. He answered the questions. Now, Jeffrey Lacasse, a professor at FSU, very smart guy, book smart guy. Luis Rivera, maybe not book smart, but definitely a street smart guy. Again, hundreds of people underneath him. At the age of 15. That's a born leader. And also a born criminal. Now, Mr. Zengane went over this with you. I'm going to go through it a little bit more. Talking about jury instructions and how you should weigh his testimony. After the enumerated topics, you're going to have this one where it says you must consider the testimony of some witnesses with more caution than others. And what they're talking about are people that are in Luis Rivera's situation. Defendants who say they committed a crime with somebody else and are going to get a better deal by testifying. This is the same instruction you'd have if, a guy buying drugs is going to testify against a guy selling a small amount of drugs for low-level felony cases. Never is it more applicable than in a case where the witness was spared the death penalty and got a few years on top of an already huge sentence on a federal case. Did the witness seem to have an opportunity to see and know the things about which the witness testified? My answer to that is no, because none of it is true. His response to it, I was drunk and high, I don't remember. Did the witness seem to have an accurate memory? Not at all. Because he was impeached by the actual facts in the case. Not other witnesses, not stuff that by the evidence in the case. The kids were in preschool. There's no phone call. Was the witness honest and straightforward in answering the attorney's questions? No. Did the witness have some interest in how the case should be decided? They've got him by the neck. He violated the agreement. He's looking at a violation of probation. Does the witness's testimony agree with the other testimony and other evidence in the case? No. The electronic evidence, the evidence that can't lie, cell phone records. I don't think Creighton Preschool is going to be lying. It's a stipulation between the parties, meaning it's true. Has the witness been offered or received any money, preferred treatment, or other benefit? He gets to serve his state sentence in a federal facility, and the benefit will be the massive deal that he has got. Had any pressure or threat been used against him? Did the witness at some other time make a statement that is inconsistent with the testimony he or she gave in court multiple times? Has the witness been convicted of a felony? 5 times. Federal racketeering case. Now, for those of you that don't know, the RICO statute, that's the things that they use to prosecute the mob. This is for sophisticated crimes. These are for major crimes. And he's also got a murder conviction. He's pretty much checking every box on the jury instructions of why you should not trust him. But again, they want you to trust him. A guy who can't be trusted. The person that you must believe. You must. The case against Sigfredo Garcia is different. The case against Catherine Magbanua, you must believe Luis Rivera to convict. He cannot be trusted. We talked about that pile being a crime was committed, this pile being the evidence against Catherine. This testimony doesn't belong in either of those piles. It belongs right there. Let's go back to the how and the why. Rivera, we've reviewed it. How and why are we here in trial? The government, desperate.
If you're going into a different area, we're getting pretty close to needing a break for the jury.
Different area, perfect time.
Okay.
Thank you.
Take 10 minutes, right?
No, it's okay. I'll get some over.